This is Reconstruction, Social Studies Standard 8.5-1. The standard reads, and the essential questions are as follows. Analyze the development of Reconstruction policy and its impact in South Carolina, including the presidential and congressional Reconstruction plans, the role of Black codes, and the Freedmen's Bureau. The essential question number 1 is, how did the Reconstruction policy develop? Number 2 is, how did Reconstruction impact South Carolina? What are the differences and similarities between the presidential and congressional Reconstruction plans? What role did Black codes play in Reconstruction? And how did the Freedmen's Bureau assist in Reconstruction? Plans for Reconstruction were developed and promoted by President Lincoln and Johnson, and also the United States Congress. The purpose of President Lincoln's plan, formulated before the end of fighting, was to end the war as quickly as possible. Lincoln's plan. Number 1. Amnesty. Full pardon or amnesty for all Southerners except high-ranking Confederate officials. Number 2. Readmission. 10% of people who voted in 1860 pledged loyalty to the United States, and former Confederate states support emancipation. This is what Lincoln required. And lastly, slavery question. Limited suffrage for former slaves. Suffrage is considered being able to vote and participate in government. So Abraham Lincoln wanted limited suffrage for former slaves. There were some radical Republicans who, number 1, were a small but loud group of Republicans who disagreed with Lincoln's plan. They wanted to punish the South, so they proposed the following. 50% of Southerners take loyalty oath. They also wanted former Confederate leaders to be stripped of any political power. They wanted former slaves to be granted full civil rights. Lincoln killed the proposal plan with a pocket veto. The disagreement between Lincoln and the radicals in his party caused a stalemate between the president and Congress. Before their differences could be resolved, Lincoln was assassinated. Lincoln's vice president, Andrew Johnson, became president and inherited that stalemate. If you don't know what stalemate means, make sure you look it up, along with pocket veto. Reconstruction plans. By requiring that only 10% of the population swear allegiance to the Union before they could reconstitute their state governments and send representatives to Congress, Lincoln hoped to convince Southern states to end slavery. Lincoln's assassination did not significantly change this presidential Reconstruction plan. President Johnson basically continued Lincoln's 10% policy and the additional personal purpose of humiliating the Southern elite by requiring that they individually request a pardon or ask for forgiveness from President Johnson and ratify the 13th Amendment that freed the slaves. Johnson quickly granted pardons to the prominent Southerners who requested them. President Johnson's plan. He wanted to keep most of Lincoln's ideas, but he also required states to declare secession illegal, ratify the 13th Amendment. He also demanded that wealthy planters and high-ranking Confederates ask him again personally for forgiveness or ask him for a presidential pardon. The picture below is a picture of Andrew Johnson. By December 1865, all former Confederate states had met Johnson's requirements for readmission to the Union. Johnson considered Reconstruction complete. Southern states held elections and rebuilt their state governments. Many former Confederates regained power. Southern states passed black codes to help restore order to the South. Similar to the old slave codes, these laws or black codes applied only to African Americans and severely restricted their freedom. South Carolina and Mississippi had some of the harshest black codes of all the southern states. One of the reasons why is because they had a higher population of African Americans in those states. Therefore, those African Americans would have a little bit more political power if they were allowed to exercise it. This engraving shows a black man convicted of vagrancy, which was part of the black codes. He was being auctioned off to the highest bidder. So basically, if a black person was not working or they were considered to be loitering or hanging around, they would be convicted of vagrancy. That's what that means. And they were auctioned off or sold back into slavery. This was part of the black codes. So the Republicans gained control of Congress. President Johnson toured the country in 1866 to support Democrats running for Congress. He also urged states not to ratify the 14th Amendment, which is the Equal Protection Amendment. His actions helped Republicans win a landslide victory in elections that year. Republicans now had a veto-proof majority in the Congress and would take full control of Reconstruction. So the Radical Republicans act. First, the Republicans in Congress refused to seat former Confederates when they returned to Washington, D.C. Now, can anybody tell me why, or can you think of why that might have been? Reconstruction was far from complete. Radical Republicans were ready to challenge the president. Republicans in Congress took steps to protect freed people and grant them civil rights. They passed a bill to extend the life of the Freedmen's Bureau. They passed the Civil Rights Act of 1866. We'll look that up at a later time. Johnson vetoed both measures, but Congress overrode the president's veto. Again, that's an example of checks and balances. And Congress then passed the 14th Amendment. Congressional Reconstruction started happening. So while these presidential Reconstruction plans had their own objectives, by the time of Congress's plan, there were other objectives. So the reason Congress passed the Reconstruction plan was to protect the rights of the newly freed slaves as well as the Republican political power. During the months after Appomattox, when the Confederates surrendered, when Congress was not in session, the South Carolina legislature and legislatures in other southern states passed black codes. Again, we'll look at black codes, and elected former Confederates to Congress. Congress refused to admit returning Southern officials to Congress. Increased violence against freedmen and President Johnson's opposition to congressional efforts to secure the rights of freedmen by his veto of the extension of the Freedmen's Bureau and his opposition to the 14th Amendment significantly changed the course of Reconstruction policy. So again, President Johnson was against extending the Freedmen's Bureau, which was helping those black citizens, and he was opposed to the 14th Amendment, which would actually make a law saying that they were protected and that they were citizens of the United States. As a result of the voting public's reaction to the violence in the South against African Americans and the action of President Johnson, the so-called Radical Republicans won a majority in the congressional election of 1866 and passed a congressional plan for Reconstruction, which we've already reviewed. This plan called for military occupation of the former Confederacy, splitting it into 5 military districts. South Carolina was in the 2nd military district, and each district had a military governor, and the army was used to enforce its provisions. So now we have the military coming down south to enforce the Reconstruction policies. And up next, we'll see a map of the military districts of Reconstruction. As you can see, South Carolina is listed with North Carolina in District 2. Congress impeached Johnson to ensure that as commander-in-chief, he would not undermine its efforts. Although he was not removed from office, Johnson's power was curtailed or was shortened, or he was limited in what he could do. The Union Army attempted to enforce the Reconstruction policy and the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. We will be looking those up. What does it mean to impeach a president or any government official? What legal reason did Congress give for impeaching Johnson? What was the real reason behind his impeachment? Even though Johnson was not removed from office, how did impeachment affect him? So make sure you look those items up or pay attention to those items once you run across them in your reading of Chapter 6. Southern states had to ratify and promise to abide by the 13th Amendment before they could form new governments. The 13th Amendment affected emancipation of slaves throughout the United States and brought profound social change for Southern African Americans. Freedmen worked to consolidate their families and communities, established a network of churches and other autonomous institutions or institutions that operated independently. They claimed equal citizenship. They got an education and carved out as much independence as possible in their lives. So the African Americans were really on the move during this moment in history with reclaiming their lives and becoming American citizens. Constitutional amendments. The 14th Amendment was designed to protect the political and social rights of freedmen from this intimidation. And that intimidation they're talking about is from the KKK. And we'll get into that more later. The 14th Amendment overturned the Dred Scott decision by recognizing the citizenship of African Americans. It upheld the rights of all citizens to equal protection before the law and due process of law. And if you remember, the Dred Scott decision said, number one, that African Americans were not citizens. They were considered property, therefore they had no rights, and the slave owner could take them where they wanted to. So the 14th Amendment overturned that decision from the 1850s. The amendment required that 2/3 of Congress vote to grant amnesty or forgiveness to ex-Confederates before they could hold public office. It included a provision that was designed to force states to grant political rights to freedmen by reducing representation for states that didn't allow African Americans to vote. This provision, however, was ineffective. And if we think about what we discussed before, the number of representatives in the House of Representatives is based on the population of your state. At that particular time, they were only counting 3 out of 5 of the slaves, which was established in the Three-Fifths Compromise. So now that the slaves are free and they are considered citizens of the United States, we're counting all of them. And there were already 60% of the population in South Carolina. Therefore, they would have a majority in the political decisions in South Carolina. So this is very important. Make sure you study this. The 15th Amendment was passed to ensure that the right of all male citizens to vote in the North as well as in the South. If you keep in mind what we talked about before, in South Carolina, if you were a male over the age of 21, you could vote in elections. But that did not happen everywhere. South Carolina was a leader in that particular movement. But now the 15th Amendment, which the Constitution supersedes all laws in the land because it's the supreme law of the land, says that all male citizens can vote. That's in the North as well as in the South, and that their right to vote could not be denied based on race, creed, or previous condition of servitude. Meaning if they were an indentured servant, they couldn't be denied the right to vote. If they were a slave, they could not be denied the right to vote as well. The amendment was also motivated by the desire of the Republican Party to secure its political power in the South. The Southern vote, largely made up of the vote of African Americans, had contributed to Ulysses S. Grant's election in 1868. And he was a Union general. Ulysses S. Grant actually won the presidency in 1868 due to the African American vote. South Carolina refused to ratify the 14th and 15th Amendments. I wonder why. As a result of Congressional Reconstruction, the military governor of Military District 2 required South Carolina to hold a convention to write a new state constitution that would recognize the amendments. This is that convention that Robert Smalls actually took part in and helped write the Constitution of South Carolina in 1868. So make sure you look up Robert Smalls. South Carolina's Constitution. States needed to revise their constitutions to be readmitted to the Union again. Democrats boycotted South Carolina's Constitutional Convention. You might want to ask yourself why they would want to do that, and then make sure you come up with a list of reasons why from your reading. How was South Carolina's convention truly revolutionary? Think about African Americans being present and them not really having having a majority in the political arena. What changes were made to South Carolina's Constitution? We'll look these up. How did South Carolina change as a result of the new government?